This lesson is about African Americans during the Revolutionary Era from the years 1740 to 1783. Please note Canvas for relevant text references related to this lesson. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to discuss the contributions African Americans made to America's fight for independence from Great Britain, evaluate the advantages and disadvantages support for American patriots and British loyalists held relative to their status as enslaved or half-free people, and examine primary source materials related to the status of enslaved Africans during the Revolutionary War. Let's begin. Tensions between American colonists and the British government mount after the end of the French Indian War in 1763. The source of this tension was war debts that had accumulated as a result of that war. The British Parliament claimed that colonists had to share war costs since war had been waged in their defense. And in an attempt to satisfy what were in their eyes legitimate debts, the British government levied a series of unpopular taxes on the colonists. There were several such taxes Britain imposed on the colonists over a period of roughly 12 years. Some of these taxes included such things as the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and the Sugar Act. Levels of resentment toward all these taxes created rebellious activities from colonists. Britain sent permanent troops to the colonies in response to these activities to monitor the behavior of the colonists. As if all that wasn't enough, in time it wouldn't just be the taxation policies of the British that the colonists took exception to. They also resisted practices sanctioned by laws that they felt were deeply unfair. Laws such as 1774's Quartering Act, which required colonists to feed and house British soldiers in their private homes and at their own expense. These laws were passed without anyone in London's Parliament to serve as the voice for the colonists. The presence of these troops, plus the taxes that were levied on colonists that had been done so without their consent or without their full knowledge, created cries of taxation without representation, and accusations of tyranny and a desire for liberty. The colonists' desires to seek independence from Britain were not just political in nature. These desires were inspired by an 18th century intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an intellectual and cultural event that originated in France and later spread to throughout the rest of Europe during the 1700s. This movement emphasized human reason and rationality and extolled their virtues in addressing societal issues related to such things as organized religion and government. Leading colonial figures were deeply impacted by the writings of European Enlightenment philosophers, such as England's John Locke and France's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. John Locke was an English political philosopher who wrote 2 treatises on civil government in 1690. In it, Locke would assert that all men were born free and equal in rights, and that they had a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. One of Locke's near contemporaries was Frenchman Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in 1732 would write the Social Contract. In the Social Contract, Rousseau defined the substance of a concept he called consent of the governed. This concept stated that the authority that government asserts over its people is only as legitimate as the legitimacy that the people themselves give it. In other words, government exists only by the permission of the people that government seeks to govern. These radical ideas would inspire white colonists to seek independence from a government whose authority that they no longer wish to recognize. But where did such proclamations of liberty and a desire for freedom from British oppression as white colonists saw it leave the nearly 445,000 enslaved Africans in America? As white colonists filled the air with cries of liberty against tyranny and with cries that they no longer wish to be the slaves of England, and the doctrines of inalienable and natural rights swirling in the air, enslaved and free blacks, especially in the North, would seek to join them. In street demonstrations and eventually in battle, blacks played an integral role in America's fight for liberty, while holding out hope that theirs would be a fight for their own liberty as well. Crispus Attucks is an example of one who held such aspirations. Attucks was part African and part Nantucket Indian. Formerly enslaved, he ran away to freedom and ended up working on ships in a local rope factory in Boston. He helped to organize a demonstration against the presence of British troops stationed in the Boston area, who sometimes took civilian jobs to supplement their pay as soldiers. This practice, however, undercut the labor opportunities for American whites and free blacks in the area. A multiracial group under the leadership of Crispus Attucks marched against the British military guard at the Customs House on Boston's King Street. In response, British troops guarding this building opened fire on the demonstrators, killing 4 people. One of those killed was Crispus Attucks, who was actually the first to die from the fire. This would make him among the first to die for American freedom in the Revolutionary era in an incident that is better known as the Boston Massacre. Take a look at this brief video clip that gives a little bit more background biographical information on Crispus Attucks.
Crispus Attucks was the first martyr of the American Revolution and is the only Boston Massacre victim whose name is commonly remembered. He is regarded as an important and inspirational figure in American history. In 1768, British soldiers were sent to Boston to help control growing colonial unrest, but this only increased tensions with those colonists who opposed the presence of troops. On March 5th, 1770, a crowd of colonists confronted a sentry who had struck a boy for complaining that an officer was late in paying a bill. As anger escalated, a church bell was rung, as it would be in case of fire or other emergencies, drawing people out of their homes. The British soldiers of the 29th Regiment of Foot were called to duty in response. The townspeople began hurling snowballs and debris at the soldiers. A group of men led by Attucks approached the vicinity of the government building. Violence soon erupted and a soldier was struck with a thrown piece of wood. Some accounts name Attucks as the person responsible. 5 Americans were killed and 6 were mortally wounded. Court documents state that Attucks was the first one killed and that he took 2 bullets in the chest. The poet John Boyle O'Reilly wrote the following poem for the unveiling of Attucks Monument. And to honor Crispus Attucks, who was the leader and the voice of the day, the first to defy and the first to die, with maverick, car, and gray. Call it riot or revolution or mob or crowd, as you may. Such deaths have been seeds of nations, such lives will be honored for aye.
In the midst of all the talk about liberty and freedom, black women would add their voices as well, especially the one shown here, Phillis Wheatley. Born in Africa in 1753, Phillis Wheatley was kidnapped and sold at an auction at age 7 to a prosperous Boston family who educated her and treated her as a family member. She learned English with remarkable speed, and although she never attended a formal school, also learned Greek and Latin. Wheatley's rare gifts were cultivated. She came to know the Bible well, along with 3 English poets, Milton, Pope, and Gray, all of which touched her deeply and exerted a strong influence on her verse. Her literary gifts, intelligence, and piety were a striking example to her English and American audiences of the triumph of human capacities over the circumstances of their birth. Through her poems, she became an unapologetic voice for liberty. In 1772, she wrote such a poem addressed to British civilian officials who were stationed in America. It said, "Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Aft's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast, steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case, and can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway?" For their part, leading colonists grappled with the paradox African enslavement presented to their own pursuit of liberty. Take Thomas Jefferson, for instance. Jefferson's famous line in the Declaration of Independence, in which he would proclaim that, quote, "All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," seemed to be a direct contradiction to the practice of slaveholding in the American colonies. As the holder of 200 enslaved human beings himself, it was a practice with which he was well familiar. Jefferson had an interesting way of addressing this. He would blame America's participation in slavery on the British. See, what a lot of Americans don't know is that the document widely esteemed as America's birth certificate, the Declaration of Independence, actually went through 3 revisions before its final copy was signed and enshrined in the annals of history. There was a paragraph addressing slavery in earlier drafts that for some reason didn't seem to make it into the final copy. Let's take a look. As stated earlier, Jefferson would blame American colonial participation in enslavement on the British government. Look at what he says here. "He has incited treasonable insurrections of our fellow citizens with the allurements of forfeiture and confiscation of our property." Understand that the antecedent of the pronoun he in this passage and others that we will take a look at refer to the reigning king of England at that time, King George III, for whom the state of Georgia is named for. Note this next passage. "He has waged cruel war against human nature himself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce, determining to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting these very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he had deprived them, by murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people, with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. What does all of this mean in plain English? Essentially, he's blaming the slave trade on King George. He's blaming the practice of the domestic slave trade, which is alive and well in colonial America, on King George III. And he even went so far as to suggest that colonists themselves wanted to bring an end to the practice of slavery through legislative fiat, but that their efforts got stymied by King George III himself. This was kind of remarkable, and again, those preceding passages never made their way into the final draft of the Declaration of Independence. But how did Thomas Jefferson really feel about black people? In 1774, 2 years before he penned the words to the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson would reveal his biases in a pamphlet entitled Notes on the State of Virginia. He includes a whole section on African descendant people, and what some may argue is one of America's first written declarations of white supremacy. Note what Jefferson would say about black people on the following slides. Jefferson writes, "The first difference which strikes us is that of color. Whether the black of the Negro resides in the reticular membrane between the skin and scarf skin, or in the scarf skin itself, whether it proceeds from the color of the blood, the color of the bile, or from that of some other secretion, the difference is fixed in nature, and is as real as if its seat and cause were better known to us. And is this difference of no importance? Is it not the foundation of a greater or less share of beauty in the two races?" He keeps going. "Are not the fine mixtures of red and white, one preferable to that eternal monotony which reigns in the countenances, that immovable veil of black which covers all the emotions of the other race? Add to these flowing hair, or more elegant symmetry of form, their own judgment in favor of the whites, declared by their preference of them, as uniformly as is the preference of the orangutan for the black woman over those of his own species. The circumstance of superior beauty is thought worthy attention in the propagation of our horses, dogs, and other domestic animals. Why not in that of man? Besides those of color, figure, and hair, there are other physical distinctions proving a difference of race. They have less hair on the face and body. Of black people," he wrote, "they secrete less by the kidneys and more by the glands of the skin, which give them a very strong and disagreeable odor. This greater degree of transpiration and renders them more tolerant of heat and less so of cold than the whites, perhaps to a difference of structure in the pulmonary apparatus, which a late ingenious experimentalist discovered to be the principal regulator of animal heat may have disabled them from extricating in the act of inspiration. So much so that fluid from the outer air or obliged them in expiration to part with more of it. They seem to require less sleep. A black, after hard labor through the day, will be induced by the slightest amusements to sit up till midnight or later, though knowing he must be out with the first dawn of the morning. They are at least as brave and more adventuresome, but this may perhaps proceed from a want of forethought, which prevents their seeing a danger till it be present. When present, they do not go through it with more coolness or steadiness than the whites. They are more ardent after their female, but love seems with them to be more of an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. I'm not even sure where to begin with all of this, but Jefferson is making distinctions based on the amount of pigmentation one has in their skin. And granted, these writings were produced in the 18th century, in the 1770s. Science has since shown us that there are no biological bases for what we refer to as race, that it is entirely a made up socio-political construct. But at the time, the amount of pigmentation that one had in his or her skin portended for some, including leading intellectuals like Jefferson, real biological and psychological differences. And in the view of many, this was really the formation to justify the enslavement, to justify that which was otherwise unjustifiable. And it should be pointed out that Jefferson would make these pronouncements about African American people even as he carried on an illicit sexual relationship with the woman of color, a woman by the name of Sally Hemings, a woman of African ancestry who also happened to be his wife's half-sister. Historian Dr. Annette Gordon Reed, who is shown here, explored the contours of the dynamics of Jefferson and Hemings' interactions in her 2009 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Hemings of Monticello. It's a fascinating read, and I strongly encourage you all to pick it up and read it at your leisure. Black participation in the early stages of the Revolutionary War was vehemently opposed by white colonials, despite the record of distinguished service performed by those who did serve in the early stages of the conflict. Black Minutemen such as Peter Salem and Salem Poor in Massachusetts served the American Revolutionary cause faithfully and honorably in the battles of Lexington and Concord. 1 month after these battles, the Massachusetts Committee on Public Safety prohibited the enlistment of, quote, strollers, Negroes, or vagabonds, end quote, in the state's militia. The actions of the Massachusetts Committee reflected the feelings of other colonial leaders, including George Washington, who believed that by and large black men made poor soldiers. They were dangerous. They would be hard to control in a post-war context, for if after they fought for freedom of the white colonist, surely they would expect freedom for themselves. Probably not a bad assumption to make. In 1775, George Washington issued an order that would bar all blacks, including free ones, from the Continental Army. But Circumstances would force an almost immediate change of heart, and that changed circumstance would come in the form of Dunmore's proclamation. In November 1775, the same month that Washington had barred blacks from the military in service to the Patriots, Virginia British Governor Lord Earl Dunmore issued a proclamation that promised freedom to Negroes who joined His Majesty's troops. Whites in Virginia and elsewhere began pleading with blacks not to accept the offer to join British forces, claiming that British promises of freedom was a trick. But the proclamation had the desired effect from the British perspective, in that it did cause the wholesale running away of many enslaved blacks. In Virginia, more than 30,000 slaves ran away. In South Carolina, at least 25,000 seem to have abandoned their masters, while Georgia lost 75% of its 15,000 slaves. In response, Washington issued a series of reversals of the black band policies, first allowing free blacks to join the Continental Army, then by allowing slaves to join on permission of their masters with the promise of freedom at war's end. As a result of this reversals, blacks would serve in every major battle of the Revolutionary War. Some ones to note specifically include Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell, who were two of Washington's enslaved laborers turned assistants who were with him at his famed crossing of the Delaware. Blacks also served in the Navy. James Forten, shown here as an older man, was a 14-year-old powder boy that served with distinction on board the Royal Louis. Forten would go on to become a wealthy shipbuilder who employed a multiracial workforce and would become a leading Philadelphia citizen. Numerous blacks served in French regiments bought in to help the Americans. These blacks were likely slaves from France's Saint-Domingue colony, which would later become Haiti. One such example was Henri Christophe, whose English name was Henry Christopher, and who, after serving as an attaché with French-aligned forces in battle against the British in Savannah, would go on to become a Haitian official after leading the revolution there. The Revolutionary era rhetoric of freedom, liberty, and equality did have an effect on some colonists' attitudes toward slavery. Some would see the inherent contradiction of the values of the Revolution and the enslavement of fellow human beings. Anti-slavery societies formed in many parts of American colonies as a reflection of these ideas and these revolutionary principles. Many colonies would enact manumission laws during the Revolutionary War years as a way to bring about an end to the institution. Nearly every northern state passed manumission laws in the late stages or immediately after the war for all blacks who served in the military during the war. Manumission was achieved in several ways. Massachusetts abolished slavery by judicial decision in 1783. In New Hampshire, the new state constitution of 1784 banned the practice. Still, other northern states passed gradual emancipation acts through their legislatures. Pennsylvania in 1780, Connecticut in 1797, New York in 1799, and New Jersey in 1804. As for the South, manumission acts were met with a high level of resistance. This was due in no small part to the centrality of slavery to the Southern economy, as was pointed out to you in the last lesson. This was an economy that was growing more dependent on enslaved labor with each passing year. In the next lesson, we will explore the squandered opportunities to have abolished slavery right at this nation's founding, and the relatively conservative approach that the framers of the Constitution took toward the institution known as America's original sin. This concludes this lesson. Please consult Canvas for relevant text references related to the lesson you just completed.